You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We are joined today by author Casey Sherman to talk about his New York Times bestselling book, Helltown, the Untold Story of a Serial Killer on Cape Cod. Casey, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, guys.
I loved the book. It was truly fantastic, but it sounds, based on the sales, everybody has loved your book so far. We are thrilled that you're taking the time to talk to us about it.
No, my pleasure. I'm very happy to be here.
Do you pay attention to stuff like, where are we on the New York Times bestseller charts and stuff like that?
Sure, I think you have to. I'm competitive by nature, and I wrote this book with an idea that I wanted to elevate the genre of true crime. So I didn't know how that was going to be received by traditional true crime readers. I'm glad that they took this journey and really followed my lead on it, and so far the response has been overwhelming.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about your professional and educational background before we go down the Tony Costa rabbit hole?
Sure. I call myself the accidental author, guys. I never believed I'd be writing books of any kind until I was thrust into the spotlight because of my work on one criminal case, one of the biggest cases in American history, the case of the Boston Strangler. And for me, it was a personal journey because my aunt, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, was the youngest and final victim in this notorious 1960s murder spree. So I grew up with true crime, and there were questions about the guilt or innocence of the self-confessed Boston Strangler. And those questions led me to journalism school at Boston University. Those questions led me to a 25-year career as an investigative journalist. The first book I ever wrote was a memoir about my reinvestigation of my aunt's murder, called A Rose from Mary, and I thought there was an overwhelming response to that book. It was a surprise bestseller, and I thought, okay, I can do this. There are other stories that need to be told, and Helltown is now my 15th book. Quite frankly, guys, I wasn't planning on ever going down the path of a serial killer story again until this story really grabbed me by the shirt and wouldn't let me go.
You've covered all sorts of other stuff. There's sports and there's some crime. You've written Hunting Whitey about Whitey Bulger, one of my favorite mobsters. What was it about Helltown and this Tony Costa mystery, as Kristin mentioned, that sort of put that on your to-do list where you thought, I really have to write about that?
The inspiration came during the height of the pandemic. I just wanted to get the hell out of the house like we all did. And I just picked up my brother one day on the Cape, and we drove the length of the Cape, just having a great day amongst ourselves. We end up in Provincetown, and we've been there so many times before growing up on the Cape. It was the height of tourist season. All of the businesses were shuttered. And so we began to talk about the ghosts, real and imagined, in Provincetown, and ultimately we landed on the Tony Costa murder case because we were driving past a lot of the different landmarks and milestones in that murder case, and we both knew the Costa murder case but didn't know it in detail. How we learned about Tony Costa, we were children of the 1970s growing up on Cape Cod, and he was really looked at, or at least talked about, as the boogeyman. So if we were going out on Halloween, it would be watch out for Tony Costa, or Tony Chop, as people called him, because he'll take you away. He was really folklore and myth until I went back to my writing office here and I did a deep dive on the cases. And I could not believe how barbaric this murder case was. I've covered up to 50 homicides in my career as an investigative journalist, including Jack the Ripper. I've never seen anything this bad and this brutal and this vicious before. And I was shocked that the story was lost to history. I explained why it was lost in the book Helltown, but that ultimately became my challenge to take a look at this case with a fresh set of eyes and implore some unique techniques by bringing in two and iconic writers and following their journey into darkness with this case as well.
The English teacher in me was absolutely thrilled to see both of my loves combined in one book. It's true crime and it's American literature. I was hooked from the minute that I started reading it. Before we do a deep dive, can you just walk our listeners who may be unaware of Tony Costa through what he did? Just give us Tony Costa in a nutshell.
Sure. Tony Costa is the real-life epitome of Norman Bates in Psycho. He was a serial killer who had mother love-hate issues. He was an amateur taxidermist, but he was also incredibly charming. And he was a hippie-like messiah who drew young, beautiful women into the dark woods around Provincetown, specifically in a town called Truro, beautiful landscape on Cape Cod, and drew them to their murders. Tony Costa stabbed, shot, murdered these women, and then dismembered them and buried them in shallow graves. Again, this was a shocking crime that went unsolved for many months. And during the public awareness of this case, two writers, Norman Mailer and Kurt Vonnegut, become darkly obsessed with this case. And I think they wanted to explore the darkness and evil within themselves. And I write about that journey in this story. And there are a lot of comparisons, Kristin, between Tony Costa and Charles Manson. And those are legitimate comparisons because both were very charismatic. They were operating in 1968, 1969. 1969, and that whole era, guys, was a landscape on which I wanted to paint for this book because I look at it, what we're dealing with here in 2022. In 1969, the Summer of Love is a distant memory, right? America and the world is still reeling from the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy, of Martin Luther King. Then you've got a very bloody Democratic National Convention and the protests in Chicago. You've got the Nixon inauguration. You've got Chappaquiddick, you've got Woodstock, the moon landing, and ultimately the coda to the story, the Manson murders in LA. And my characters in Helltown touch upon all of these major historical events, and I wanted to really bring that into focus.
The comparisons between Tony Costa and Charles Manson are just chilling, and even down to the fact that they did share a follower, Linda Kasabian. Because you've done plenty of research on Costa at this point, why do you think that Charles Manson became so well known and Tony Costa never quite reached that same level of notoriety?
I think it's pretty simple. Manson and his followers murdered famous people. They murdered Sharon Tate. And it was a story that unfolded in real time in Hollywood. But as I said, I have a lot of authenticity and authority in the true crime space, having covered all the homicides that I've covered. The Tony Costa case is right up there with the most brutal serial murder cases in American history. And I never wanted to glorify his work, his murderous work. Person is reading. The book is dedicated to the women, to the victims in this case. And I wanted to really make them flesh and bone again and really talk about them as young women with all the hopes and dreams that young women had at that time. And these women should all be grandmothers right now. They should be enjoying their grandchildren. But for the most part, they were frozen in time at 19 years old or at 22 years old. And one of the things I wanted to talk about in this book and the conversation I wanted to have was that I wanted to explore against women back in 1969. And I think a lot of that still exists today, especially with the Me Too movement. Women were disposable in 1969. When women go missing in Provincetown, nobody cares. Some of their family members don't care. Their friends don't care. They just disappear and nobody is racking focus to what happened to these women. And I just thought that was a very tragic part of this whole story.
You talk about it in the book. There's this idea of the transient nature of people coming and going, especially in a place like Provincetown in 1969. And there's visitors and there's people that are there and gone every single week. The way that these kind of hippie girls, young women, are referred to is really pretty disparaging. They don't seem valued. And a lot of people don't seem terribly concerned that there actually could be something going on involving a series of serial murders. It seems like
that's right. And
nobody cares.
Bill, I'm sorry. But I also think that they were looked at as opportunities. They were exploited by not only, obviously, the killer, but by the people around them, the district attorney in the case. It became a story where let's use these young women to elevate our careers. As I said, I wanted to focus on them. And again, it goes back to my 19-year-old aunt, Mary Sullivan. I always focus on the victims first in their journeys and what they went through and what their families must be going through even to this.
By the way, we didn't mean to move too quickly past what happened with your Aunt Mary Sullivan. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? That's
sure
covered in your first book, A Rose for Mary.
Yeah, Rose for Mary was my first book published in the early 2000s, and this was the culmination of a reinvestigation I had done on her murder and on all the Boston Strangler murders. Mary Sullivan was a 19-year-old, 1962 graduate of Barnstable High School on Cape Cod. She had just moved to Boston 4 days before she was murdered on January 4th, 1964, in an apartment right in the heart of Beacon Hill, that's postcard Boston, one of the safest areas in the city. She turned out to be the youngest and final victim of this murder spree. And my investigation, Bill and Kristin, focused on the fact that there wasn't just one Boston strangler. There wasn't Jack the Ripper resurrected to stalk the women of Boston. That didn't happen. There were several killers murdering these women for their own purposes. And they had a blueprint for how to do it because the grisly details were printed in the newspapers at the time. But the police knew that it wasn't just the work of one man. And I have gone through all of the police reports and the records, much like I did in Helltown. And you find the threads and interview the original task force, Boston Strangler Task Force investigators who had at least 6 suspects in these 11 homicides.
I was listening the other day to a podcast that I'd listened to and enjoyed before, Stranglers. And I was listening to the first episode and was like, it's Casey. Oh my gosh.
Was I in it? I've never listened to it. I didn't sit down with them. They probably gleaned audio that I'd given in many of the interviews that I've done in this case.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought that you'd actually worked with them on it. You were in the first and the last episode. They were talking about your reinvestigation into Mary's case.
It's interesting. I wasn't against the project. I'm certainly happy that people are talking about this case now 60 years after the murders, which is, I think, a great opportunity to talk about the murders that occurred in 1969 in Provincetown. Again, these murders were lost to history, buried by history, but they deserve to be discussed. These victims deserve to be remembered. And that was part of the mission that I had writing this book.
I know that as a professional journalist, it's probably pretty hard to faze you, but you mentioned earlier the crimes are absolutely gruesome. How did you deal with the horror of looking at the crime scenes and having to deal with all of that? It is stomach turning.
It is. And I had the benefit of 3,000 primary source documents in this case, court transcripts, all of the trial transcripts, plus the crime scene reports and witness interviews. But what really brought it home for me, Bill and Kristin, was the autopsy photos and the crime scene photos of these women. They're the most, and I've seen many. They're the most vicious I've ever seen. It didn't look like these women were actually stabbed. It looked like they had been mauled by a great white shark. The frenzied attacks on these women show something that is beyond disturbing.
This alter ego that you talk about in the book, how much of that were you able to draw from, or are you taking some artistic license there, Casey?
That's a great question, Bill. Sure.
This other being that seems to take over.
Part of it was taking a little step into the literary nonfiction field and recreating scenes. But all of those scenes in the book are based on the killer's unpublished manuscript called Resurrection. I had actually had access to that. So for the first time, I can bring you into every single crime scene through Tony Costa's eye, while he is trying to blame these vicious murders on somebody else. So it was an alter ego that he blamed. It was a young man living in Provincetown named Corey Devereaux, who Tony Costa blamed the murders on. But there was another Corey Devereaux, meaning Costa's alter ego, that was buried deep inside him. Like I said, one of the things you have to do, guys, is just when you write a book like this, you go back into the history of the killer. So realizing that he was the son of a single mother, his father was killed during World War II. He was a World War II hero, actually saved the life of a fellow sailor. But Tony Costa never met him, grew up with this woman who he really loved. And by the time he's 5 or 6 years old, she realizes that she can't support him on her own. So she meets a guy and they get married and they have a son of their own. And now Tony Costa's got to share his love with them. And then that is the moment where he begins to split, I think, mentally. And he starts to, and many serial killers have done this, he starts to take his aggressions out on birds and small animals, then household pets. If you had a toy poodle in his neighborhood when he was 15 years old, good luck ever finding that thing again, because it was probably stuffed and put under his bed. And he was arrested for assaulting a young girl, 16 years old, when he was a teenager. And instead of getting the help that he sorely needed at that time, getting him the psychiatric help he needed, his family protected him. His mother protected him and pleaded with the judge, be lenient on my son. I will send him away to live with family on Cape Cod, which is what she did. Never addressed his issues. He moves to the Cape. She followed him. And then his prey begins to get a little larger. He starts to hunt down wild animals on the outer Cape. And eventually he graduates, if you will, to human beings.
So he had a total of how many victims? Remind me on that.
He was convicted of 2 murders. We know that he killed at least 5 women. I would probably double that number.
Okay.
He did travel a lot. We talked about a little bit of the comparisons between he and Charles Manson. It's interesting to note that both Tony Costa and Charles Manson lived in the same neighborhood at Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco in 1967. They attended the same parties. They were in the same rooms together. And I have eyewitnesses that have put them in the same rooms. They've had conversations. I don't know what they said to each other. I don't know if there was any cross-pollination going on, but you've got 2 killers evolving into monsters, breathing the same air, which I thought was pretty frightening.
Dual coasts. Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. What a strange coincidence. The other victims, potential victims, Casey, that you're thinking of, even if you can't confirm, are there other unsolved cases in that area or the areas where he traveled that would make sense?
Yeah, there are unsolved cases in San Francisco. There are unsolved cases in New York City, obviously. There are also unsolved cases in New England. There were upwards to 300 young women who had gone missing in 1968, 1969 in New England alone. How many of them made it home to their families, I can't tell. But I know that just based on his killing methods, this isn't something that he did just 4 or 5 times. He had to grow into the killer he became when he murdered Pat Walsh and Marianne Wysocki in January of 1969 and then buried them in shallow graves in Truro.
So you posit right at the end of the book that the lady in the dunes case may be attributable to one of Tony Costa's followers, the one you described, Strawberry Blonde. Can you tell us a little bit about the lady in the dunes case?
Sure. That's obviously a notorious unsolved mystery on the Cape, and there have been many theories over the past 30 years as to who this woman was and who killed her. Some of those theories focused on Whitey Bulger, the crime boss from Boston. Now, I wrote the book Hunting Whitey Bulger, which was about his 16 years as a fugitive. I also am the only one, including my co-author for that project. We're the only ones who ever interviewed Whitey Bulger's killer, who was just indicted last week.
Yes.
So we got very deep into the Bulger case. Bulger did not do this. Bulger did not kill any woman in Provincetown, even though he traveled there. It wasn't his M.O. Stephen King's kid, Joe Hill, posited that the lady in the dunes was an extra in the movie Jaws in 1975.
Yeah, people love that theory.
Complete ridiculousness.
It's a great story.
Yeah, it would have been a great story if it was true.
If it was true, yeah.
Tony Costa was considered a suspect in this unsolved murder right from the get-go, but he couldn't have done it because he was killed in prison in 1974. And it was the summer of 74 when that happened. And then a month later, a woman is found dismembered in the Provincetown dunes. Her identity has never been discovered. Her killer has never been discovered. But I've had access to the crime scene photos in that case. And I look at the cut wounds. And I see a lot of similarities there. And I go back to the similarities between Costa and Manson. Both had families and disciples who are willing to commit crimes and kill in their names. And my theory is that the follower of Tony Costa committed this murder to appease Tony Costa's restless spirit. They were heavily into witchcraft at the time, and not the Wiccan subculture that's out there that is focused on the sky, the moon, and the land. This was dark art, dark magic that they were exploring in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Have there been efforts to identify the lady in the dunes? Do we know where she's buried? Could she be?
We know she's buried almost in an unmarked grave in the same cemetery that Tony Costa's buried in. There have been numerous efforts, DNA analysis, craniofacial reconstruction. They've tried to find out her identity for decades, and no one has ever come forward to claim her body. There's been no DNA match with anybody in any database in the United States or abroad. It's really that this woman is in an unmarked grave. It's very sad that the victims of Tony Costa were buried in shallow graves that he dug. He, after he was killed or committed suicide, received a Catholic burial in Provincetown. There's no justice in that.
No, to put it mildly. I'm wondering if we could take another crack at the Lady in the Dunes case. Obviously, we're big supporters of investigative genetic genealogy. It seems if the support was there, that might be an interesting way to go with trying to identify her, which might at least give them a new, fresh start in terms of that investigation.
Sure. And I think it's an open case in Provincetown, and certainly there are people all around the world that are focused on finding out who she is before you can find out who killed her. So the more smart people that get behind a project like that, never say never. Hopefully that we will find out who she was, who her family was, and ultimately why and how she was killed.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
So you'd mentioned a couple of minutes ago about Tony Costa's followers, and I hear that when you went onto the Cape to do some book signings, you had some, I'm not going to call it issues. I don't think we justify it by calling it an issue, but I did hear that there was some interesting developments in terms of Tony Costa's followers maybe hassling you or giving you a little bit of an issue.
And that kind of comes with the territory when you're an investigative journalist. But I will say, in 1968 and 69, Tony Costa was protected. He was protected by his family and by his friends, and they intimidated and harassed witnesses. They intimidated and harassed police officers and investigators. Had Tony Costa been arrested before he was, maybe Pat Walsh and Marian Wysocki would be alive today. So now, 53 years later, I had a book event scheduled in Provincetown at the only bookstore in Provincetown, and it was abruptly canceled. And I found out that the same people, friends and family of this serial killer, were intimidating the bookseller and threatening the bookseller. And yeah, I've received some intimidating emails and threatening emails, but I'm not really concerned about it. Oh, you have to always keep your head on a swivel, especially looking at the recent attack of Salman Rushdie, and artists are being attacked openly now. It is a concern, but it's really frightening that you've got these people that are still trying to protect a serial killer's dark legacy 53 years after the crime. So about 3 weeks ago, I got an email from the bookseller, great guy, and I felt really bad for him. He's just trying to run a business. And he said everybody was trying to come in and looking for the book Helltown, and they couldn't find it because it wasn't for sale. So he bought 2 boxes and asked me to drive up to Provincetown and sign them, which I did. And I thanked him for his courage and his support. And I'm not going to cower to any online mob, for sure. And the facts in the story stand up to the story that I wrote. And I'm sorry that the family is still trying to protect this guy.
So is that his ex-wife, Avis, that is doing some of this?
I think she's certainly somebody who's been sympathetic to that online mob. But there are other people that claim that they're family and friends of Costa, and they're the same people that I read about in police reports going back to 1969 and 1970.
And you're thinking, oh, this name looks familiar.
Sure. Provincetown's a small area. I call the book Helltown because that was the nickname given to the area in the 1700s when it was a pirate community. And it's a town that's always followed their own rules and made up their own law, still to this day in many ways.
Did you work at all with Liza Rodman? Her book, The Babysitter, came out about the Costa case. Actually, I was reading Helltown, and I was like, why does this sound so familiar? And I had to think about it, and then I was like, oh, I had read The Babysitter a couple of months prior. Did you work with Liza?
I didn't know Liza. I knew she had written the book, and I took a look at it. I grazed it over. I don't want to ever follow anybody's tracks when you're writing a book like this. She had an event in Provincetown canceled, and they really attacked her online, a lot of the community members. So I reached out to her the next day, and I said, I'm going to support you on this. This can't stand, and I'm going to side with you. And we're going to have a united front against some people that are trying to crush free speech and trying to protect the serial killers. So I have a lot of respect for Liza.
Were you more comfortable, for example, having book events elsewhere, say on Mid-Cape? I know Provincetown, it does feel like the end of the world, and it's certainly the end of the Cape, and it's a really cool place. But if you felt like the pressure was too much on a local level, would you be more comfortable Mid-Cape or elsewhere?
I'm comfortable everywhere I go, Bill. I would have been comfortable going into Provincetown for that event. There was a film shot here in Massachusetts last year called The Boston Strangler.
Oh, sure.
Stars Keira Knightley. It's coming out next year. And I could have called the producers and demanded that they do not shoot in Massachusetts because all the families are still there. I don't have any right to do that. I have a right to support the film or not support the film, but I don't have a right to dictate who can. So I feel the same way with the Costa family. They have no rights. They don't own this story. They have no right to dictate who can read about Tony Costa's murderous exploits and this dark period in history. So I don't have any qualms about visiting Provincetown, and I have zero trepidation on any other book event that I do. And I've been on book tour for 47 days and talking at bookstores or big venues all across New England and in New York City, and I don't have a worry about that.
Has anyone ever shown up from the Costa family to challenge anything? That you seem to have done your research, you did your homework. I certainly didn't get the sense, except for the areas where we talked about where there's literary license, where you're
Sure.
helping to create for the reader a
and provide that
conversation.
connective tissue. And that tradition goes back to In Cold Blood with Truman Capote. It actually goes all the way back to Death in the Afternoon, written by Ernest Hemingway. I was looking forward to kind of expanding and painting a little broader when I wrote. That's why I created some of those, or recreated some of those scenes. But it's interesting that people have appeared at these events and they knew Costa. Many of them knew Costa very intimately. And I've learned a lot from these exchanges after these events. They don't come at me in a threatening way. They want to talk and have a quiet moment and share perspective and insight about him, which is certainly very helpful to me.
They're entitled to, if they wanted to have a more positive outlook on Tony Costa. In other words, you paint him, I think, accurately as the monster that he was. But if somebody else feels differently for whatever reason, I think they're certainly entitled to that opinion with threatening the owner of the bookstore in Provincetown.
It's like somebody threatening them for having a positive opinion on one of the most vicious serial killers in American history. I follow certain social media threads on Facebook, and I see that Tony Costa had a birthday recently, and there are people in the community that were talking about Tony Costa like he had lost his life saving 3 people in a fire in glowing terms, and not the vicious serial killing absolute monster that he was.
I want to take a minute and pivot back to Kurt Vonnegut and Norman Mailer, because that was a whole different side of the story. And I was, like I said, I'm an English teacher and I'm a nerd. I was thrilled to read this. How did you learn that Kurt Vonnegut and Norman Mailer both had this obsession at the same time in about the same area?
I think you and I are both literature nerds, Kristin. I am a huge fan of literary biographies, and I've read a lot about Norman, and I've read a lot about Kurt. And this common theme that I found in both their stories was their obsession with this murder case that was happening in their backyard in 1969. And then you look at these two iconic writers as people. And in 1969, when we meet Kurt Vonnegut in Helltown, he's not the Kurt Vonnegut that we remember today. Struggling author. He's been out of print for years. He's got an automobile dealership on Cape Cod that is failing. He's trying to support his family, and he's got this story in his head that ultimately will become Slaughterhouse-Five, which becomes an anti-war anthem for an entire generation. And he's been running away from horror, meaning the horror of World War II, since the 1940s, since he was a POW and survived the Dresden firebombing, the most deadly firebombing in Europe during World War II. 25 to 30,000 people were killed and burned alive. And it was his job to bury the dead. How do you come back to the United States, Kristin, and get a job and raise a family? So there's a lot of empathy and sympathy that I have for Kurt.
Yeah.
Norman is on the other side of the spectrum. He's been a best-selling author since Naked and the Dead in the 1940s, and he looks at himself as the heir apparent to Ernest Hemingway, both in his writing and in his larger-than-life kind of lifestyle. But he's got a lot of darkness in it. And there's a passage in my book that I remind the readers of, that Norman Mailer shouldn't have been free in 1969. He should have been in jail for attempted murder, because he did try to kill his second wife, Adele, during a cocktail party in 1960, stabbed her with a penknife. And he would have gone to jail for it, but she didn't testify against him. And he was really interested in exploring that darkness. Do you cross that line? And certainly Costa was somebody that I think he looked at and studied almost as an anthropologist in many ways.
I was going to say, though, who among us hasn't wanted to stab their significant other with a pen, really?
I can't talk for my wife, but I'm sure I've driven her crazy many times. But Norman was a dark guy, brilliant, as was Kurt. And both of them approached this story in different fashions.
Were their families willing to help you out on the project?
I did have some correspondence with Edie, and I did speak privately to Michael Mailer, who's Norman's son. I didn't want to rely heavily because they were young at the time, and I just wanted to focus on the characters that I had learned about, that I wanted to write about. I really took it upon myself to build or sculpt in Norman out of my own clay.
I have said something regarding the Colonial Parkway murders, my sister's case in Williamsburg, Virginia, that I believe that the town fathers for Williamsburg, which is a very tourism-dependent community, everything they could to paper over the Colonial Parkway murders. I believe that the National Park Service did everything they could to cover up those murders, and I believe that the economic interests of Colonial Williamsburg, etc., were also one of the reasons why a lot of people, even several years later, had never heard of the Colonial Parkway murders. Given the fact that Cape Cod and Provincetown have very similar economic drivers, where it's a tourism-related area, do you feel like the fact that the Costa's story never really achieved the same level of visibility as, say, Manson, do you think that the economic drivers of Cape Cod had anything to do with that?
Yeah, I think before I answer that question, Bill, I just want to say I'm sorry for your loss. What was your sister's name?
My sister is Kathy Thomas. She's a United States Naval Academy graduate, and she and her girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski, are the first two victims in the Colonial Parkway murders, which we talk about on Mind Over Murder.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for talking a little bit about her. I do think that given the fact that you've got two areas that rely heavily on tourism, I think that does factor into it. Cape Cod relies on tourist money. And it was interesting that I think the town fathers were trying to downplay these murders. The first time that one of the women whose bodies is uncovered in a shallow grave is even reported on, I think it was page 27 in the Boston Globe. Now, that's absolutely insane that they'd be relegated to the back pages of a major newspaper. Today, you'd have it splashed on the front page or other bylined articles. But I think the town fathers tried to keep it quiet, but I do think that people took advantage of it as well, because there were people trying to sell sand from the crime scenes right on the highway, Route 6A on Cape Cod. But it reminds me, Bill, of that scene in Jaws, where you've got the mayor saying the beaches are going to be open this weekend, and it's going to be beautiful. And I do think that there was a little of that, certainly, probably in both cases.
Oh, yeah. That's a great comparison. Absolutely. So you probably don't want to go into a ton of detail about your next project, but can you tell us a little bit about your next project?
Sure. It's a story that unfolded in Los Angeles in the 19th. Very shocking murder that brings in Hollywood glamour and kind of the golden era of gangsterism.
Yes,
in Hollywood.
Sounds great already.
I'm a big fan of LA Confidential, both as a book and as a film. My agent and I have been looking at different projects that might mirror that story a little bit, and we think we've landed on one, and I'm starting to work on that project very soon.
So this would be a book first, and then hopefully...
It would be a book first, yes. I've been very fortunate in my career to have my books adapted into films. Patriots Day with Mark Wahlberg was based on my book, Boston Strong, and The Finest Hours, which is another Cape Cod story about a Coast Guard rescue that happened in 1952, became a big Disney movie in 2016 with Chris Pine and Casey Affleck, and it's very popular on Disney+. And that's an inspirational story about Cape Cod. And now I'm writing a dark story about Cape Cod in Helltown. But there is ways to be inspired by Helltown as well, because even though we talk about some of the people that were exploiting young women in the 1960s. I also racked focus on two investigators, Bernie Flynn and Tom Gunnery, who did everything in their power to find this killer and put him behind bars. And they were very tied into the families of the last two victims, Pat Walsh and Marianne Wysocki. So I look at them as real heroes in this story. And not to segue further, but I do also include a chapter on Chappaquiddick in Helltown, because it was relevant to the case, and it also spoke to this treatment of young women in 1969.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I poured over 2,900 pages of documentation from the grand jury investigation of Chappaquiddick, and I was shocked when I read it. And I grew up on Cape Cod. Mary Jo Kopechne should be alive today, much like Susan Perry, Sidney Monson, Marianne Wysocki, and Pat Walsh. She was alive in that Oldsmobile for several hours. She asphyxiated. She didn't drown. And the culprit was a U.S. Senator named Ted Kennedy.
It's such a shame. And his level of irresponsibility is just incredible. I didn't want to move past The Finest Hours too quickly. First of all, I loved the film. And then my girlfriend Pamela grew up on Cape Cod, and she had never heard this story. We ended up seeing the film and really loving it. And she said, how did I grow up in Barnstable and I never knew about this incredible rescue?
That's what I said to myself when I was doing a book signing in Chatham for my first book on the Boston Strangler case. And my brother Todd had stumbled upon a very small memorial to the rescue in 1952. And he raced to my book signing and he said, I have your next book. Told me what little he knew about it.
Really?
I went to a place called Rock Harbor where that 36-foot wooden lifeboat stands today, is birth. And I said, how did this little lifeboat save so many men? That became this now international maritime phenomenon, book and film.
That actually sounds like something out of a movie right there, where he comes running in and saying, I've got your next book.
You always, after that, Bill, anytime somebody says that, I have to listen because it pays off.
Wow. That's fantastic. So the book is Helltown, the untold story of a serial killer on Cape Cod. And it was fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Kristin. I appreciate that.
That's going to wrap it up for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.